Robert Schuller, the pastor of the Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, once asked this question: what would you do if you knew that you cannot fail? Now, it's a great question. Leave the fear of failure out of the picture and just dream of everything you could do. Now, for a visionary like Robert Schuller, it's not that difficult of a question. If you're unfamiliar with the story of how the Crystal Cathedral came into existence, here's the Reader's Digest version. In 1955, Schuller founded the Garden Grove Community Church, and he started conducting worship in a drive-in movie theater. Now, for those of you who are too young to remember what a drive-in movie theater was, it was a place that you drove in your car, and there was a little speaker that you'd put on the window, and the screen was out in front of you, and instead of sitting in a theater, you would sit in your car and watch the movie, and you could hear it through the speaker. They didn't show movies on Sunday night. It had to be dark. That was the big thing about going to the drive-in, is because you went there after dark, because it had to be dark enough for you to be able to see the movie. Because you can't just turn off the lights like you can in a movie theater. Well, since there were no movies shown, on Sunday morning, Schuller rented out the drive-in movie theater. He would stand on the roof of the concession stand, because what's a movie without popcorn, right? He would stand on the roof of the concession stand, and they would hook the microphone up to him, and so people would drive into the stalls, and they would put the speaker on their window, and that's how they attended church. In 1968, 13 years later, the 13-story Tower of Hope opened on that same site. They were eventually able to buy the drive-in theater. They tore it down, and they started building their church campus. And so the Tower of Hope was built as a come-in or drive-in church. People could go in and sit in pews and chairs like you are today and listen to the sermon, or they could still listen from their car. In 1970, Schuller began broadcasting his worship services on TV, and within 5 years, the Hour of Power. How many of you remember the Hour of Power? Yeah. Within 5 years, his worship service was being broadcast in all 50 states somewhere. And the Crystal Cathedral, the building that most of us remember from the TV broadcast, was opened and dedicated in 1980. What would you do if you knew you cannot fail? That's a pretty impressive answer. And yet, in 2010, the church, after facing years of internal leadership problems and facing $55 million in debt, filed for bankruptcy. In 2013, the 40-acre campus was sold to the Catholic Diocese of Orange County and is now used for the spiritual home for over 1.2 Catholic worshipers. So in spite of Schuller's famous question, failure is still very much a part of our lives and a part of the picture in many of our decisions. Now, of course, this situation and our interpretation of what happened in the story of the Crystal Cathedral depends upon our definition of failure. And that definition might determine whether or not it really is a failure or not. Garden Grove Community Church was no longer able to sustain their ministry in this location, and the church failed. That's one interpretation. But we could also look at it this way. Garden Grove Community Church was able to impact millions of people in God's name for a period of time. And like the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, there is a time and season for everything. And the season came for this church to go in a new direction. We could also look at it this way. The 40-acre campus continues to be used by and for God's kingdom in new ways. We're continuing our sermon series this morning on living life unafraid, and if it hasn't been made clear, we're talking today about the fear of failure and how this fear can paralyze us. It's real simple when we're talking about a situation in which we are not ourselves involved, and to look and say, well, yes, Garden Grove Community Church failed or it didn't fail, but what if we were a part of that situation? Or what if the situation was something different in which it did affect us? What happens when we insert ourselves in the picture of potentially failing or succeeding? The fear of failure is one of the most prevalent of human fears. And in a culture and a society that reveres winners and makes success of the appearance of success the only option, nobody wants to fail. Because failure is a trait of losers. And none of us want to have that label associated with us. But here's something to consider. We sometimes don't realize how many chances we have for failure each day that we don't even recognize. Living our daily lives includes risks. You took a risk when you came here this morning. You'll take another one when you leave. Any number of things could have happened or might happen to us as we get into our cars and leave. Now, sure, we do everything that we can to ensure that we will be safe, and we make choices that lessen the risk that we face. But that risk is still there. We might fail to make it to the restaurant we're going to after lunch. We might fail to make it home. Does that dictate our choice? Is everyone going to stay here this morning and never leave this building again? No. If we always allow our choices to be dictated by whatever is risk-free, completely safe, and the most convenient path to prevent failure, what we find is that we are failing to truly live. I can't remember, was it Chelsea, was it you that said, if we don't try, we're going to miss out on a lot of things in life? 2 weeks ago, we looked at the Israelites who allowed fear to paralyze them 1 mile from the promised land. Well, years before that, Moses was paralyzed by fear while standing in front of a burning bush. First, he was paralyzed because, well, who wouldn't be paralyzed by fear standing in front of a burning bush that was speaking to us? But then he became paralyzed because of what that voice was telling him to do. God told Moses to return to Egypt, to go to Pharaoh and command him to release the Israelites from their bonds of slavery. And here's what Moses had to say. Our second lesson this morning comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 3 and 4, some selected verses. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. But he, then Moses, said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth to you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs. Moses, I've got a job for you. Moses' response, a whole lot of excuses. Now sure, Moses might have been fearful to go back to Egypt. After all, he was a wanted fugitive. He had killed an Egyptian before he ran away. And so he might have been fearful about what would return to him should he go back to Egypt. But that reason didn't make the list of excuses that he gave God. You can't send me. I'm a nobody. I can't go. I don't know what your name is to tell them. That was in a section I didn't read. You can't send me. They aren't going to listen to me. Another part that I didn't read out loud to you. I can't go. I'm not eloquent. I don't talk good. All you English people out there are just cringing at what I just said. Those don't sound like a fear for his life. Those sound like excuses for the fear of failure. Chances are many of us have found ourselves in the same situation as Moses, faced with something we needed to do or could have done. And we might have had the same reaction that Moses did. You've got the wrong person for this job. There are a couple of things that we need to remember when we're faced with this kind of fear. Remember our acronym of the word fear. E stands for examine your assumptions in light of the facts. So let's examine our assumptions about the fear of failure. Just like the puzzle that we were afraid we couldn't get done before church ended today, most things aren't as hard as you fear they will be. And even if you do fear, the pain ends up being not as painful as you worried that it might be. It's often the unknown that we fear the most. When we face the fear and we stop allowing it to keep us from starting, we can be surprised at what we can do. Maybe we won't fail. Maybe we'll succeed. But when we factor in God's promise to always be with us, there really is nothing to be fearful of. For if God is for us, then who can be against us? Next is something that author Adam Hamilton says in his book that he learned at a time management course. Successful people are willing to do the things that unsuccessful people are unwilling to do. That means they aren't going to let the fear of failure stop them because they know that they might succeed. But doing the things that unsuccessful people are not willing to do means that we might have to make some hard, unpopular decisions. It could mean that we'll have people disappointed in and with us. We'll talk about that fear next week. It might mean that we do things differently. It may require stepping out in faith into a place that you've never been before. Those things are hard. They are scary. I'm not going to stand up here and try to tell you that they aren't. But if we don't do them, we never realize our full potential. Fear can keep people and fear can keep organizations from ever doing what God wants them to do. Finally, the riskier path is the one that you should often take. Jesus spoke of this in Matthew 7. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few that find it. In other words, this is not an easy task, nor is it an easy choice. Now, our broken human condition is going to prompt us and tempt us and try to tell us, I'll go down this easier path. There's less risk. Physically, we're programmed to avoid risk. Remember the amygdala that we talked about a couple weeks ago that looks at a situation and tells us, is this a threat or not? And do I fight or do I run away? As his followers, Christ calls us to take the harder path, that while it's going to be more work, it will ultimately bring us much more joy and reward. All of us have most likely been afraid of failure at some point in time. Failure can be painful. Yet nearly every rewarding thing that we'll experience or do in life comes with a chance that we might fail. A well-considered faith in God reassures us that regardless of the outcome of the risks we take, even the worst thing that could happen to us is not the end of the road. God still rules over the universe, even if we fail. And somehow God brings good even when we do fail. Becky read to us this morning from Romans 8:28. It's one of my favorite verses. All things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. What we view as a failure, God can use to bring something even greater. As a tomb was sealed, there were those who laughed and said, that takes care of this Jesus. What a failure he was. 3 days later, we witnessed what God can do with man's perceived failures. And what better promise do we need to live unafraid? Amen.